Imagine a medical revelation, something that totally flipped the script on how we fight disease. And it all kicked off because of one woman in Baltimore back in 1951 who just went to the doctor about something bothering her.
Yeah, it's an incredible story.
Today, we're getting into the really compelling and complicated story of Henrietta Lacks.
Henrietta Lacks, she was a young African-American woman, mother of 5. She goes to Johns Hopkins Hospital because she feels this knot.
Right.
What nobody knew then, least of all her, was that some cells taken during her treatment, they'd become the first immortal human cell line. HeLa, they called it.
HeLa.
And these cells, I mean, they became absolutely fundamental. They drove progress in, well, practically every part of medicine we know today.
But that's really just scratching the surface, isn't it? It's not just about the science. It's tangled up with her personal life, her family, and these huge ethical questions that we're still grappling with.
Exactly. It's deeply personal and broadly ethical.
We've really dug into this, looking at the science, the ethics, the legacy, and also how it was portrayed later, like in the HBO movie. We want to piece it all together for you, give you the full picture.
Yeah, understand the impact.
So let's start at the beginning. Who was Henrietta Lacks? The woman herself, before the cells became famous.
Right. To get the full weight of this story, you need to know about her life. She was actually born Loretta Pleasant, August 1st, 1920, in Roanoke, Virginia. Why the name changed to Henrietta, well, that's a little bit of family mystery.
Huh, okay.
She grew up in Clover, Virginia. And get this, in a former slave cabin. Her mother died when she was only 4.
Wow.
So that sets the scene, right? The segregated South, tobacco fields, a really tough upbringing. That history is crucial context.
You can almost feel that weight, the difficulty of that time and place. And she started her family young.
Yeah, she had her first child as a teenager. Then in 1941, she married her cousin, David Day Lacks.
And like so many Black families looking for better opportunities, they moved north, part of the Great Migration.
Right, heading for work. Exactly. They landed in Turner Station, Maryland, near Baltimore. It was this buzzing industrial community near the Bethlehem steel plant where Day got a job.
So building a life there.
Building a life, raising their family. They have 5 children eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Lawrence, Elsie, David Jr., they called him Sonny Deborah, and Joseph, who later changed his name to Zachariah.
5 kids. And what was she like as a person?
From everything we gather, she was really vibrant. People remember details. You know, her hazel eyes, she liked wearing red nail polish, always kept her skirts neatly pleated. Little things that make her real, not just a name associated with cells.
Yeah, it brings her to life. But then things changed. January 51, she feels that not.
That's when she goes to Johns Hopkins. And it's important to remember, Hopkins was one of the few places back then that would actually treat Black patients because of segregation.
A stark reminder of the times.
Definitely. And the diagnosis came quickly. February 8th, Dr. Howard Jones told her it was aggressive cervical cancer.
And the treatment back then, pretty rough.
Brutal. Radium plaques. Standard for the time, but really harsh. And it was during this treatment, this is a critical moment, 2 small tissue samples were taken. One from the tumor, one from healthy tissue nearby.
Without her knowing.
Without her knowledge, without her consent. That just wasn't standard procedure then, especially for poor Black patients. The samples went to Dr. George Autokay.
The researcher.
Yeah, a researcher at Hopkins who was, well, obsessed with trying to grow human cells in the lab. He'd been trying for years to find cells that could survive outside the body.
So while her cells were about to become this scientific marvel, her own health.
It declined incredibly fast. The cancer was just relentless. The radiation treatments were grueling. Her records mentioned severe burns, intense pain. It just wasn't enough.
She passed away so young.
October 4th, 1951. She's only 31 years old.
31.
And her story, in a way, just vanished for a long time. She's buried back in the family plot in Laxtown, Clover, Virginia. No headstone, just an unmarked grave for decades.
Unbelievable until much later.
Much later, 2010, that's when headstone was finally placed. It calls her a phenomenal woman, wife, and mother. It's such a stark contrast, isn't it? The quiet, unmarked grave for so long, while her cells were taking on this huge public immortal life.
Yeah, which brings us right to the HeLa cells. The science is amazing, but the ethics. That's where it gets incredibly complicated. What made her cells so special? Why did they survive when others didn't?
That was the absolute key. They were, for all intents and purposes, immortal. Most human cells, you put them in a lab dish, they divide a few times, then they die. So it's senescence. But Henrietta's cells just kept going, dividing, multiplying indefinitely.
They didn't have that built-in limit.
Exactly. Dr. Gay knew immediately this was something huge, a breakthrough. By 1952, think about it, just a year after she died, HeLa cells were being shipped out.
Shipped how?
Through the regular mail, postal service. Can you imagine? Sending living human cells like a package.
That's why.
And then pretty quickly, the Tuskegee Institute set up what was basically a HeLa factory, mass-producing these cells for researchers everywhere. It gave scientists this consistent, reliable tool they never had before. They could finally do long-term experiments, figure out basic cell biology.
The scale of the impact is just mind-boggling. What are some of the biggest things HeLa cells helped achieve?
Well, the list is enormous. Probably the most famous early one is the polio vaccine. Jonas Salk used HeLa cells to test it.
Right. That was massive.
Huge. They needed a way to grow lots of poliovirus safely, and HeLa cells were the answer. It helped basically eradicate polio in many parts of the world. But it didn't stop there. Chemotherapy development, especially for blood cancers, understanding how viruses work, in vitro fertilization, mapping the human genome, cloning, HeLa cells were involved in all of it.
It's staggering. You hear numbers like 80,000 studies, patents.
Yeah, over 80,000 studies, nearly 11,000 patents linked to them. Somebody even calculated the total weight of HeLa cells ever grown, over 50 million metric tons.
50 million tons.
It's an almost abstract number. Enough to wrap around the Earth multiple times if you laid them end to end. An unbelievable contribution from someone who never knew.
Which circles right back to the core problem. All this incredible science, all this progress, built on cells taken without consent.
That's the crux of it. Informed consent, as we understand it today, just wasn't the norm in 1951, particularly for Black patients, poor patients. Hopkins served the community, yes, but the power dynamics, the racial biases, they were deeply embedded in the system.
So taking samples like that wasn't seen as unusual.
Not particularly unusual for the time, sadly. But what followed the massive distribution, the commercialization later on, companies making huge profits, all while her family knew nothing and received nothing, that's where the injustice really compounded.
It wasn't just a single act, but the decades that followed.
Precisely. Her case really forced a hard look at how research was done, especially on vulnerable populations. It became a catalyst, eventually leading to stronger rules, like the common rule we have today for protecting human subjects. But it took a long, long time.
And the family themselves, when did they even find out? That's where Rebecca Skloot's book comes in, right? Bringing the story to a wider audience.
Yes, absolutely. Rebecca Skloot's book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, came out in 2010. It was a landmark work.
It really was.
It wasn't just dry science. Skloot wove together the medical history with the incredibly moving story of Henrietta and her family, especially her daughter Deborah's search for answers. It spent years on bestseller lists, won awards. It just resonated deeply.
And that led to the HBO movie.
It did. The film came out in 2017, starring Oprah Winfrey as Deborah Lacks and Rose Byrne playing Rebecca Skloot.
Oprah as Deborah. And the family was involved in making the film.
Yeah, that was really important. Two of Henrietta's sons, David Jr., Sonny, and Zachariah, and her granddaughter, Jera Lacks, why, they were consultants on the film.
That must have been intense, seeing their story told like that.
I can only imagine. The movie really focuses on Deborah's perspective, her quest, her need to understand her mother, this larger-than-life legacy, and also the heartbreaking story of her sister, Elsie. Yeah, Henrietta's second child. Elsie had developmental disabilities and spent most of her short life in what was then called the Hospital for the Negro Insane, later Crownsville State Hospital. Deborah's journey to uncover what happened to Elsie is a huge part of the story.
Oh, wow. So the film tackles the tough stuff, the inequality, the family's pain.
It definitely does. It shows the racial inequities in healthcare, the feeling of being exploited, the confusion and grief the family went through for decades. It got an Emmy nomination, which speaks to its power.
When you look at the film versus the historical record, how accurate is it? Does it stick to the facts?
Overall, it does a pretty good job. The basic timeline of Henrietta's life, her diagnosis, the radium treatments, her death, that all lines up with medical records and Skloot's research.
And the portrayal of the medical care at the time.
It accurately reflects the substandard care Black patients often received. That's backed up by historical data, things like lower hospital admission rates, less pain relief, higher mortality. Even specific details from Henrietta's records, like the severe pain and burns from radiation, are shown.
Are there places where it simplifies things? For dramatic effect, maybe?
Sure, that's common in adaptations. Her early life in Clover is a bit condensed, perhaps, but key elements are there portraying her as a loving mother, even the detail about the red nail polish, which came from family memories.
What about Dr. Gay, the scientist?
He's shown accurately, I think, as being driven by the science, not by malice or profit. He shared the cells freely, and the film correctly shows the cells were taken without consent, which was standard practice then, however wrong it seems now. The HeLa factory at Tuskegee is also depicted correctly. Maybe the lab environment looks a little more dramatic than reality, but that's filmmaking.
And the family finding out. How's that handled?
The film really nails the emotional core of that, centered on Deborah's experience. Oprah's performance captures that mix of grief, anger, determination. It shows the moment they found out in the 70s from a Rolling Stone article.
Rolling Stone.
Really? Yeah, not a scientific journal, a popular magazine. Imagine finding out about your mother's immortal cells that way.
Oh my God.
The film shows their shock, confusion, the mistrust, when researchers suddenly wanted their blood without really explaining why. And the story of Elsie at Crownsville. It's gut-wrenching, but it draws on real hospital records uncovered by Skloot.
So, emotionally true, even if some details are condensed. What about the legal and ethical fights?
That's where it simplifies a bit more. It captures the feeling of injustice, the lack of benefit to the family, the exploitation, but it doesn't get deep into the weeds of specific bioethics debates or legal cases that came later, like the 1974 regulations or the lawsuits against researchers like Chester Southam, who injected people with HeLa cells.
Understandable for a movie, I guess. Focus on the human story?
Exactly. It hammers home the central ethical failing, the lack of informed consent in 1951, especially given the racial context. And it makes clear the injustice of the commercialization happening without the family even knowing, let alone benefiting.
And these arguments, these ethical questions, they haven't gone away. They're still incredibly relevant.
Not at all. They are front and center today. Who owns our bodies, our tissues, our data? What rights do we have when our biological material contributes to profitable science? How long did it take the Lacks family to even find out? These are live issues.
You can understand the family's anger when they learned in the 70s that companies were making money off HeLa.
Completely. And then researchers showing up wanting blood samples. It bred deep mistrust. But paradoxically, the whole HeLa situation did fuel the push for better ethical rules. The 1974 Common Rule, the requirement for institutional review boards, IRBs, at research institutions, HeLa was part of the backdrop for those reforms.
But even with rules, things still happen, like the genome being published.
Right, that was 2013. Scientists sequenced the entire HeLa genome and put it online. Huge privacy implications for the Lacks family, obviously, because it contains genetic information passed down through generations.
And they hadn't agreed to that.
No. There was a massive outcry from scientists, ethicists, and the family. The data was quickly taken down. It showed that even decades later, the ethical handling of HeLa and the Lacks family's rights remained incredibly sensitive and complex.
It really highlights the ongoing struggle, which leads to the recent lawsuit.
Yes, finally, in 2021, the Lacks estate sued Thermo Fisher Scientific.
A big biotech company.
Huge, arguing unjust enrichment, that they'd profited massively from Henrietta's cells without permission or compensation for decades. And significantly, on August 1st, 2023, what would have been Henrietta's 103rd birthday, a settlement was reached.
Do we know the terms?
No, it's confidential.
Huh?
But the family, her grandson, Alfred Lacks Carter Jr., called it justice after 70 years.
70 years? That's a lifetime.
It is. And Johns Hopkins has also made statements acknowledging they could have and should have done more sooner. They're opening a new building in 2025 named in honor of Henrietta Lacks.
A step towards recognition.
A step. And there's also the Henrietta Lacks Foundation, started by Rebecca Skloot, which helps the family with education and health expenses and advocates on these issues.
So, tying it all together, why does this story from 1951 still matter so much to us, to you listening right now?
Because it's not just history. It's almost certain that HeLa cells have impacted your life, or the life of someone you know. Vaccines you've had, cancer treatments developed, basic understanding of biology. HeLa is woven into the fabric of modern medicine.
It forces us to ask big questions.
Really fundamental ones.
Yeah.
About our bodies, about science, about justice. Who gets to benefit from scientific progress? How do we ensure that progress doesn't come at the cost of individual rights, especially for those who have historically been marginalized? Understanding Henrietta's story is key to thinking critically about medical ethics today.
It's such a potent story. One woman's cells, taken unknowingly, traveling from a tobacco farm in Virginia to labs all over the world, changing everything. It's a reminder that behind the science there were always human beings, human stories.
Absolutely. And the HBO film, it really brings that human dimension forward. It makes you engage with the ethical complexities.
So, as we wrap up, maybe the takeaway is to really think about those complexities. As science moves faster and faster, especially with things like genetic data, biobanks,
Yeah, how do we move forward?
how do we make sure that scientific progress truly respects people, respects their rights, their legacies? Henrietta Lacks' story doesn't give easy answers, but it powerfully frames the questions we still need to ask.
Maybe checking out the film or reading Skloot's book if you haven't, or looking into the Lacks Foundation. These are ways to keep engaging with this vital story and its lessons.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for digging into this with us.